Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? So, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Meg Bouvier. My cat and I are here today. She's on my lap. I don't know if you can. Here we go. You know me as the creator of your library of NIH training courses. I've helped clients land over $500 million in federal funding, and I'm here to answer your grant writing questions. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get started. So, what you should be viewing or doing right now in terms of your membership, we are in the midst of a boot camp. So, tomorrow, which is October 31st, we will pardon me, while my cat exits the scene. We will be doing chapter 3 of Master the R series. If you haven't attended the first two sessions, that's just fine. You can join now if you'd like. So if you are interested in registering for the boot camp, Riley, can you drop that registration link in the chat box for people? We're going to start talking about writing the research strategy. So in particular, tomorrow we'll be talking about how to write the significance and innovation section. So we'll be digging into the details of the new scoring criteria. So it's a great time to drop in, and don't worry too much about having missed the first couple of sessions because they're recorded and you can watch them at any time. And it looks like Riley just put that URL in the chat. The other thing that you have available to you is we are beta testing a service called First Fridays, and we will be doing one, not surprisingly, on Friday, November 1st. So the first Friday of every month at 11:30 Eastern Time, I have a 30-minute, essentially virtual office hours where you can just drop in and ask me questions and get one-on-one advising on your particular set of circumstances. So if that's something of interest, feel free to register for that as well. So, Riley, I don't know if we can, if we have a separate registration link for First Fridays. I think we do. If you could drop that in the chat as well, that would be awesome. As far as what's going on at NIH, as many of you know, they are operating under a continuing resolution, which is a temporary funding bill. It happens most years. So the federal funding year started on October 1st. And as with most years, there's Congress has not agreed on a funding bill for the Department of Health and Human Services. So NIH does not have its budget. So why should you care? Because the institutes don't know what their budget number is for FY25. And when that happens, they typically operate at 80% of the previous year's budget just to hedge their bet. And that means that funding decisions are often held up. So your notice of award may be held up at this time of year, particularly if you're kind of in that gray zone of funding. So it's just a fact of life with federal funding agencies. This is the way it goes. So anyway, I would like to welcome back Dr. Agnella Izzo Matic. So Agnella, do you want to give a little introduction about the kind of work that you do?
Sure. Thanks, Meg. Nice to be back again on the live stream today. My name is Agnella Matic. I have a PhD in biomedical engineering, and I'm a former faculty member for a few years who then transitioned into medical writing and primarily publications, so manuscripts and conference materials for a career transition about 12 years ago. Meg and I have worked together in the past, and we're brought back together again the past year or so to have some chats about various things that academic researchers have to contend with in their writing, both on grant applications and their manuscripts and conference materials. So looking forward to our discussion again today.
Yeah, so I always love talking about these kinds of topics because grant applications and manuscripts are probably the two main types of writing that biomedical researchers have to do. And they are idiosyncratic and from other types of writing in the world and different from each other as well. And I think one of the mistakes that people make is in attempting to apply their skill set in one of those areas to the other type of writing. So Agnella and I really like to talk about, we like to compare and contrast best practices in terms of how people approach manuscript and grant application writing. So this is kind of a continuation of a conversation we had, I think it was a couple of months ago, where we were talking about um, the differences between manuscript writing and writing a grant application. And today, what we're going to talk about is how to respond to reviewer comments and revise. And we're going to compare and contrast so those things are the same and different in those two arenas. So, Agnella, what happens when I know that people apply to all different types of journals and that there are differences among them, but what happens when you submit a manuscript and then you get reviewer comments back? What's your next
Sure.
step typically?
Well, first, like, give yourself a little round of applause or pat on the back or whatever you would like to, because that means that you got reviewer comments back. It's a very good thing in general. It means that you passed through the editorial review who thought there was at least a good chance that this study in this manuscript would fit within the interest of the readership of the journal. So I would say the fact that you got to reviewers and got comments back from them is a great step. Hopefully, fingers crossed, those comments came back and the decision from the journal was a revise and resubmit. Obviously, most people on the call will probably have the experience where you did get reviewer comments back, but the ultimate decision from the editorial office was to reject the manuscript. I would say if you really think the reviewers were very off, one or multiple of the reviewers were very off base in their review, because if you've never been on the peer review side of things, um, when the editorial office sends out a manuscript to the peer reviewers, they will ask for both their like summary of the science, a detailed description of things that they would like to see changed with the manuscript, but then also they will ask for a, confidential judgment that goes only to the editorial office that the authors never see of usually some kind of ranking in terms of the quality of the manuscript relative to other things that are published in that journal and the novelty. Different journals do it different ways, but something like the novelty of the study, and then what's your recommendation for publication? Publish, review, revise with minor adjustments, revise with major adjustments, or reject. And so the editorial office it ultimately makes the decisions, but it is, I would say, decently heavily influenced by what the peer reviewers provide from feedback. So if you really think that there's a peer reviewer or two who made a major, error in their judgment on the manuscript and that probably led to their recommendation to reject, that then the editorial office went through with, you can go back to the editorial office and with a properly supported argument of why the peer reviewers' comments you think were not well founded for your manuscript, you can push back against some of those decisions occasionally. I wouldn't suggest you do it every time because the editorial office does have, if they've been running that show for a while, they do probably have a good sense of what papers are the right fit for their journal and which ones are not. But occasionally it does happen. We all make mistakes. There may be a peer reviewer who just had a really bad day, and you might go back to the editorial office and ask them to reconsider. Once
Good
you get the
applause there because that's
yeah,
definitely different with grant applications.
sure.
So I often have clients who come to me and say, reviewer two just completely missed the point. They didn't understand it. They don't have the expertise. They made glaring errors with this, that, and the other thing, and more dastardly accusations than that I won't go into. But I have never seen a rebuttal work at NIH, and it often does a little more than to delay the already long course of journey to funding at NIH and piss people off along the way who you don't want to piss off. So often you just, in a situation like that, you have to just take your lumps and just, the options that are open to you are to pick a different study section. And we were talking about this earlier, but technically when you resubmit an application at NIH, you can select a different study section, although it's kind of frowned upon to do that. So if you want a different study section, often people will retool it and send it in as a new submission as an A0 to a new study section, in the hope that you never have to see that reviewer again. Or you try to make the case to the SRO that you need a certain type of expertise represented on the panel. But you can never, you can never really ask that an individual person recuse themselves based on a difference of scientific opinion. You can only ask them to recuse themselves for some other, reason.
Yeah.
So you're really, if you have a reviewer who you think did you dirty, there are not a lot of options at NIH, unfortunately. You can keep submitting and hoping that you'll hit a cycle where that person is not serving on the committee, because they can sit out some sessions each cycle, each year.
Yeah,
But
I would say for the pushing back against a journal rejection is the rare case. Most of the time, I think you should move along to another journal. Still, you should take the comments from the reviewers seriously enough to the extent that you look back at your manuscript, you see what you could do to it still that would address any of those comments that you think are reasonable ones, because you may get the same reviewer at a second journal. And I have seen this happen in a
yeah.
case where I made a bunch of suggestions for people to revise based on the previous peer reviewer comments. They didn't do it. The submitted to a second journal and they got very similar comments and went back to the exact same reviewer again. So but let's fast forward though to, let's say you get some reviewer comments and it's a major revision and resubmission. So this is probably the majority of the cases. I will also say on the flips, like on the other end of the spectrum, I don't think I have ever seen a paper that was accepted without any revisions on the first round of review. So almost every single paper that gets published will go through some amount of revisions. So in that case, what I try to do is just I start working from the comments just in a, go line by line and get some basic ideas jotted down in like a framework of the response letter in terms of, okay, this is reasonable, we can do this pretty easily. This is takes a little bit more reanalysis, but okay, we can do it. And then there's always a few things that either really are not applicable to your manuscript and your data, or that are just too time or resource limiting to really implement them in the time frame that you've usually around a month or so that you're given to resubmit. And so then I go through and try to make the adjustments that are possible. I look at responding to peer reviewers from a couple of ways. Number one, I always, in those response letters, thank them for their time in reviewing and in their comments, because it's a service that's largely an unpaid service that they're providing. And there are people on the other end of it, even from the, even in the most negative sounding reviews. I tried to remember that there's a human on the other side of that computer screen who's going to be looking at this, and that my responses are going to potentially influence their second, decision, or uh, second review and second recommendation to the editorial office of what to do with my manuscript. So number one, remember that there's a human on the other end of it. And number two, I liken this one to, a parenting strategy. Try to say yes as many times as you can to the reviewer's comments, so that when you have to say no, they're going to say, okay, they said yes to 75% of the things that I've asked for, and the 25% that they're saying no to in a respectful, but B, uh, thoughtfully explained why you're saying no to it, then they'll hopefully be a little bit more accepting of those no's.
So how do you handle that if you don't want to make a change? If you think that a recommendation, because this is something that I get asked a lot at NIH, and I am not a fan. So at NIH, you write a one-page response to the reviewers. It's what it's called colloquially. The actual name is Introduction to the Revised Application. It's one precious page, 11-point font, half-inch margin, single space. You're like shoehorning everything you can into it, right? And it's, the same kind of things. You got to be super polite and appreciative, and but there are always a few things that my client is not planning to do. And the question always arises, how do you handle that? And for me personally, I never, ever, ever say things on that page like we respectfully disagree, or we do not plan on, or the reviewer misunderstood. I just answer with a fact, and that's it. So if they say, you should use XYZ assay, I would just respond with, XYZ assay would give such and such information, which, is not consistent with our hypothesis, or to use that assay would be beyond the scope of the budget and the time allowed, but we plan to do that in a follow-up R01 or whatever it is. I just answer with a fact. I never waste space on we respectfully disagree. I hate that phrase because I think it's a red flag. I think reviewers immediately zero in on it. Whereas if you just answer with a fact, they tend to just kind of like, oh yeah, they're being really responsive. So how do
Yes,
you
so
handle that?
that's another thing I was thinking about. Could be likening it to another parenting strategy, or a therapy session of mirroring and repeating what the other person has said, but then amending the end of it to, like you said, but it's beyond the scope of
Right.
this
What we can
plan
do.
for work or plan out on the future, or it would give different results than we are looking for, whatever the case may be there. I would agree that when you're actually implementing the writing of the response letter, be as either neutral language or affirmative language as you can. You want to minimize or just avoid entirely any negative, like we disagree, or no kind of statements, if you can do that in the response letter, for sure.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, if you were to give people, I think these are just hugely important. I think it's you got to have a very thick skin to be in this line of work. I think it's really, I've seriously seen clients sink into a depression when they get their first set of summary statements. Criticism is part of this job. Man, you got to have a really thick skin, and it just is what it is. I think you get better at handling it. I usually tell people give yourself a week because it's a longer time frame on grant applications. I don't think
Yeah,
you can give yourself a week on manuscripts if you've got to get the response in a month. But typically you
usually
have,
not.
yeah, typically you have more time in a grant application. So I usually tell people give yourself a week to cry in your beer and contemplate a career change, and then you can pick yourself up and work the problem. But it's really, like I've seen people really sink into a funk. I have a friend who refers to a bad set of summary statements as it's like the reviewers when they criticize your idea, your project idea, it's like telling you your baby is ugly. So we call it, I've had clients call it, I've been ugly babied when they send me this summary statement.
Oh,
So it's these ideas are near and dear to
they
people's hearts.
are.
It's very
But
hard.
kind of like you were just saying, I do think though there's an initial shock that happens that usually I try to give it a day or two for sure, because oftentimes when I go back and read it after 2 days, I'll pick it up again and with clearer head, fresher eyes, think that their comments are not actually as difficult or as negative as I originally thought they were. So I think sometimes we get all these, uh, we often perceive them to be a lot worse than they are initially. So I think reading through top to bottom if you want to at the beginning, but yeah, put it down for a few days at least before you try to go back to it and, make your next plan or do any revisions for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to pause to answer some questions because we have some questions popping up in the Q&A box, and I had at least one email to me. And feel free to ask Agnella questions as well while she's here. So here's what I'm writing, an R01 renewal. How long or short should the progress report section be? Thanks. So this person is talking about a competing renewal. So this is, for example, your R01 is funded and you come to the end of your time and you're asking for the next round of funding. So that's a special type of R01 application called a competing renewal. And if it were funded, it would be connected to the same R01 number as the first R01 was. So a progress report is arguably the single most important part of a competing renewal because the thinking is that the best predictor of success on a future grant is success on a past grant. So you need to demonstrate success on your past grant in the form of the competing renewal, in the form of the progress report in the competing renewal. Typically, I see these positioned at the beginning of the approach section, although if I remember correctly, SF 424 doesn't require you to position it there. And I recently saw one, and my cat is back to weigh in on this. So I recently saw one where they positioned the progress report in the significant section because it just made more sense for them to discuss it there in light of certain data and publications. So I would say what I typically see in terms of progress reports, I would say a half a page to a page, which is part of the research strategy. And my preferred way to format at least part of the progress report is in the form of a table. And I think I've talked about this and even given a sample of this in a mini tutorial in a past Ask the Grant Writing Expert. I apologize. I don't know what's going on with my cat, but so in the table, what I like to do is the rows are the aims of the original R01 or the most recent R01 if you've had several competing renewals. And then the columns would be, for example, what you've accomplished toward that aim, and then that would be like the middle column, and then the right column would be publications related to that aim. And it's your chance to, and in terms of the publications, if they're high impact publications, don't just use a number. I would actually write out the journal name so that they know it was published in like Science or PNAS or whatever it is. So that it's unequivocal. Here's what we said we were going to do. Here's what we did, and here's the publication that resulted from it. And then you can give some narrative, either introducing that table or underneath it to give a little more comment. But I would say it's pretty typical to see maybe a half a page to a page on the progress report of a competing renewal. Okay, so can a PI ask for additional funds on a likely fundable grant if some discrepancy is noticed in the budget submitted? If so, how to go ahead with that? Where in the process did you notice a discrepancy, and what was the discrepancy? Usually once you've submitted a grant application, your budgetary request doesn't change. I mean, having said that, POs always have more ability, more latitude than one would think. And I have seen POs do various things. Like I once had a client who was, and admittedly an eminence in the field, department chair, had been like the president of, national professional organizations, et cetera, et cetera. And she called up her program officer toward the end of her R01 and said, if only we had a few more months of funding, I'd be able to get these other papers out because we found this like really weird and unusual finding and they came up with the money. So I have seen things like that happen, even though NIH will say, categorically that they don't do that. They do. Things happen, like program officers have more latitude with this stuff than one would think. But I don't know what kind of I have questions about your question. So I don't know what kind of budgetary discrepancy you're talking about. Like, do you mean you made a mistake in the budget in what you were requesting? I would call the program officer and ask if there's anything that can be done. The standard answer is probably going to be no. That the standard answer is once you upload and you've made your budget request, that's that. But if you noticed that there was some mistake in the budget that you requested, and I don't know where you are in the review process right now, but you may want to just call the program officer and ask if there's anything that can be done. But my guess is probably not. Sorry. I've actually seen situations where, for example, people didn't read their NOFO carefully and they were participating in like a cooperative network, and the PIs all were supposed to fly in for a meeting every year at NIH as part of this cooperative network. And they didn't budget that in. They forgot to budget in the travel for the PI for that annual meeting, and they had to pay for it with other funds. That was that. Like, it was like, well, that was your problem. Should have figured that one out. So like, there's usually not a lot of wiggle room in these situations, but it doesn't hurt to ask the program officer. The worst they can say is no. Okay, and then there were a couple of emailed questions. Let's see. So this is something about an R13, and admittedly, I've not worked on an R13 in a lot of years. These are conference grants. It's quite a specific question, but wondering if by chance you have any insight. I support a PI, this is a pre-award support person. I support a PI who applied for and received R13 funding from NHLBI to host an annual conference for the past several years. So R13s are for, they're small conference grants. The R13 allows for requests up to 5 years. So, each year up to 5 years, obviating the need to submit a very similar grant application each and every year. NHLBI has indicated that they do not have the funding to award multi-year R13s. The mechanism does indicate that there is an option to secure funding from additional ICs as secondary or tertiary sponsors. Technically, that option exists pretty much all the time, even if the NOFO doesn't say it, which is why in the assignment request form, I always encourage people to list at least one other IC as secondary. You can do that on an R01, on a parent R01. Each year when the PI requests the permission to submit letter, she requests that additional ICs consider her application for funding, but it never goes anywhere beyond NHLBI. Do you have any suggestions for navigating NIH and determining who else to contact and or how else to seek funding by another IC? So your first stop, you guys are just going to be so sick to death of me saying this, but call the program officer. They're always your first stop, right? So call the PO and ask I'm sure the NHLBI and their heart of hearts would love to be able to give you this funding, but it sounds like their R13 budget is shrinking. And of course, right now, nobody has money because we're operating under a continuing resolution. So they don't even know what their R13 budget is going to be. However, that person will be familiar with this R13, and they will have suggestions for institutes that may be interested in picking up funding for one or more years of that R13. And then you can, instead of trying to do it through the NIH system, if your program officer at NHLBI says, oh, I know somebody who might be interested in that, here's that program officer's name, they're at this different institute, you can email them directly, CC the program officer at NHLBI and say, this person recommended that I speak to you about this R13. And that tends to dislodge a lot of these bottlenecks at NIH, as if you're having conversations with program officers and sending emails directly rather than checking boxes or filling out forms. that tends to dislodge, in my opinion, tends to dislodge some of these bottlenecks. So I would start by speaking with your NHLBI R13 program officer to ask if they have suggestions about which institute might be interested. And we're going to finish up with one more question. We're a little over time. Do you have experience with the R37 merit mechanism? Is this something ESIs are automatically eligible for if the percentile score passes the cutoff? I think I did a whole session on R37s if I remember correctly. So I'm going to speak off the top of my head without looking at any notes, so forgive me if this is wrong, but I know that, for example, NCI's merit, I think if you score well, you're automatically considered for your R01 to be converted to an R37. I believe that has happened to a number of my clients this year, but I'm going to bookmark that and come back to you. And encourage you to look at the log of mini tutorials in the Ask the Grant Writing Expert recordings, because I think I did a whole session on R37s one week. But yeah, so I'll get back to you, but I'm pretty sure that's my recollection, is that my NCI folks were automatically considered for a conversion from R1 to R37. But then somebody sent me something about applying for that. I got to get back to you on that one, because sometimes these things change. So I'm going to get back to you. I don't want you to take that answer to the bank. So let's bookmark that. So Riley, if you could grab that question for me, we're going to add that to the table of questions for Ask the Grant Writing Expert, and I'll answer that next session when I do a little digging. So we are over time. And Agnella, always a pleasure to have you. We'll look forward to having you back another time, anytime that you want to come. It's always fun to chat with you. And let's see, next time is going to be, gosh, our next session is going to be November 13th. How is it November? And I'll be talking about how to handle a situation where you're just knee deep in acronyms in your research strategy. There are a variety of ways that you might handle that without tripping up reviewers or gobbling up precious space defining your acronyms all over the place. So we'll be talking about that. And let us know what other topics you want us to cover. We're booking topics for like February, March, April of next year. Some of you gave us some topics in the surveys, but we're always open to suggestions. Meg@bouviergrant.com. And I wish you all the best of luck with your grant writing. Hope to see some of you at boot camp tomorrow or First Fridays on Friday. And good luck with your grant writing. And Agnella, I'll see you soon. Take care.
Thank you all. Take care. Bye.